fundamental imbalance between the parties. This was a major step forward for the rights of Quebec workers. Among other things, it marked the history of the labor movement and its struggles. Today, 46 years later, the purpose of Bill C-58 is to amend the Canada Labour Code to ban replacement workers. Bravo! Or should I say, at last. It's certainly a step forward for the rights of workers under federal jurisdiction, but above all, it's also a step backwards, an inexcusable delay that has hampered and is still hampering and will continue to hamper at least until the bill comes into force, i.e. 12 months after its enactment, the fate of thousands of workers who have lost their fundamental right to negotiate and the right to strike. Quebec workers are under two systems. There's federal jurisdiction, and under federal jurisdiction pay the cost of this injustice. There has been a lockout for almost 2 years at the port where the employer uses replacement workers. No one is talking about it. No one cares because things keep operating. It's unacceptable. Also, the employees of Videotron in Gatineau. There's thousands of jobs being transferred to call centers outside of the country, and now these workers have been on strike for several months now, and they are using replacement workers. At the port of Sorel Tracy, they're also on strike. They have been for 12 months. Metal workers also have been called in to replace to use anti-scabs. Employers have acted in full impunity because they know the Canada Labour Code, and to date has not been amended. Strike anti-scab legislation has been requested for quite some time by unions, as has the Bloc. In 33 years and 11 bills, including the very first bill introduced in 1990 by the Dean of this chamber, the member for Bécancour, Nicolas Sorel, the Liberals and the Conservatives have taken their turn blocking our bills. During the same Parliament, I tabled Bill C-276 in May of 2022. Union groups and the Bloc have led this fight repeatedly with the strength of our convictions. The NDP will take the credit. It was also part of the struggle, and we can indeed thank them for their work, as well as that of the Minister of Labour and the leadership he has shown. But, because there is a but, a really big but. In fact, because unfortunately we have to ask about the way the bill has been concocted, with, among other things, the proposed implementation deadline. Do they really have the intention to have this bill see the light, or is it just window dressing for things to look good? Mr. Speaker, you know as well as I do that there's a clear difference between appearances and reality, just like there's a difference between the virtues we signal and the values we practice. Finally, from the outset, the Bloc has been critical of the fact that the initial bill provided for an 18-month delay before coming into force after royal assent. When you calculate this delay in the presence of a minority government, you're entitled to at least question what the intent is. We tabled an amendment in committee to get rid of this delay. proposing that the bill take effect as soon as it receives royal assent. This amendment was defeated by all parties. The NDP and the Liberals agreed in advance to propose 12 months. Shameful. However, the vast majority of the unions we heard from said that it was hard to explain this delay, and they also proposed that the bill take effect as soon as it was received royal assent. If they want to protect workers, the bloc always shows up. And as soon as the bill was tabled, we announced that we also wanted to improve it at committee and quickly close this loophole so that the nonsense of using scabs could be banished forever. We proposed amendments wisely put forward by the unions, aimed at, among other things, including federal public service employees. What a big omission, Mr. Speaker. The government's legislation, as an employer, will not target its own employees. So we raised an amendment about this that was deemed, not deemed receivable, but on principle this is shameful that this legislation does not cover the government's own federal employees. This is an error that needs to be rectified. Also, we tried to bring forth amendments to modify or repeal articles that provided for exceptions to the prohibition rule. It may seem complicated. We're banning scab workers, but there are some exceptions to this rule. For example, I know full well that the employer, in case of a conflict, can use different employees. An employee from a bargaining unit from the same employer, but not in a same unit, from another bargaining unit hired before the start of negotiations to perform work normally carried out by a striking worker could be used. It doesn't make any sense. The unions have justly criticized this. It doesn't make sense under the law how some categories can be excluded, such as contractors, dependent contractors. How could they be excluded from this ban? In Quebec, this would be banned. So we need to provide for an investigation mechanism. In Quebec, we have provided for this. If we want to sanction employers and be more severe, we need to allow the Commission to its work to investigate. If the employer does not respect the law, if we have to be able to call an investigator, but this amendment was also defeated. We also want to reduce the time limits for labor relation board orders to not unduly hamper recourse to the right to strike. Sorry, I was distracted there. So, unfortunately, all of these amendment proposals were defeated. We also tried to propose improvements, which were not accepted. They were essential to the consistency of this bill's purpose, which aimed to fully recognize the fundamental right of free negotiation and the right to strike. But we can be proud to have supported them, to have lived up to our convictions, and to have listened to and supported the demands of the unions and the struggle of workers to defend their rights. We probably won't see such an exercise again in the near future. So this bill warranted more careful examination and attention to meet its purposes. And I hope history will give workers the treatment they deserve after all the suffering they have experienced over so many years. Thank you. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Victoria. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. For some time, the Bloc has had a similar position to ours, so thank you for this support for workers. Can the member talk to us about the impact that this bill would have for people? The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. As you must know, having a bill that is so robust is intended mainly to make sure that workers under federal jurisdiction can count on free bargaining rights and the right to strike. This also allows bans on the use of scab workers. It'll also allow for conflict periods to be shorter. When I'm talking about what's happening at the Port of Quebec, it's serious. We're talking about Quebec workers under a federal jurisdiction that are currently in a lockout by their employer. They have been so for 2 years, and no one cares about them because the employer uses scab workers, and this would be a major change for them. We always have to bear in mind that the right to strike and the right to bargaining are fundamental rights protected by the Charter. So normally, the Liberals should be in favor of these rights being respected. This legislation will change everything, but it should have changed before. Questions and comments? The Honourable Government House Leader. Parliamentary Secretary, sorry. Thank you.
You know, when I think of the legislation and the potential impact that it has, we can talk about those that are within federal responsibility. But I like to think that we've had the province of Quebec that the member made reference to, and having anti-scab legislation for many years now. So has the province of British Columbia. And I really do believe that by the national government now bringing forward this legislation, and getting the support of all political entities inside the chamber, it would appear, in terms of its passage, sends a very powerful message. And ultimately, I think that it could influence other provincial legislatures to do likewise and bring in anti-scab legislation. I wonder if she can provide her thoughts on that issue.
The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Every province has its own jurisdiction, Mr. Speaker, and every province can decide what social progress it would like to make in terms of labour law. In Quebec, we have this. 46 years later, Mr. Speaker, 46 years later, the federal government is now saying that it's happy with what's happening. It would even be happier if the federal government said for its own federal employees under federal jurisdiction that they would at least have the courage to include the public service employees and to ensure that this bill comes into force right now as soon as it receives royal assent, to not let this situation continue any further. And the use of scab workers. There's still to be work to be done here. Thank you. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First, I'd like to congratulate my colleague for her speech. In terms of labour law, she is unbeatable in this House. But when we had the first debates on this, many Bloc members questioned the government to know why there was this famous 18-month delay in coming into force after royal assent. And then they said, work at committee, we'll look at this. But then they worked to reduce this period from 18 to 12 months, but Does my colleague know why? Why, unlike with all other legislation that receives royal assent that come into force right away, this particular bill will take 12 months? At committee, did they find any interesting answers to this, or intelligent answers to why there is such a deadline? The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Well, you asked if there are any intelligence answers. I'm not accusing anyone of not being intelligent, but I asked the minister questions regularly, and I was told that the Industrial Relations Committee needed time to ensure that legislation would be fully enforced. So, well, I don't want to cast any shade on this answer, but when you work on the time between a bill is crafted and when it comes into force, we could imagine that the government could have harnessed all of the necessary resource to have the work start right away. So, Mr. Speaker, there's a big difference between tabling a bill and hoping to see it implemented. Thank you. Questions and comments?
The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate my colleague on her work. My colleague, in her speech, set the stage and explained why there's a lack of political will to see this bill through. So, in 1977, the government of Quebec solved this problem. So that's 50 years ago, once and for all. And so there have been efforts to bring the federal government up to speed. My colleague, the Dean of this House, Mr. Plamondon, back then in 77, I was still in diapers. So my question for my colleague is, how is it that it's taken so long? Why are we still talking about this? Why hasn't it happened? And why is there still a danger that it still won't happen? Before giving the floor to the member for Thérèse de Blainville, I'd like to remind the member that you're not allowed to name members by their name in this place. You have to name them by their riding name or by their title. And now the answer to the honourable member for Thérèse de Blainville. Just a short answer. There may be multiple reasons, but it takes political will, ultimately. On both sides of the House, after this many years, people are just having to make do in the labor world. This government has introduced multiple pieces of legislation that undermined worker rights. So it really, ultimately, the answer is it takes political will to change the ground rules. Will this be the time that it gets done? Who knows? Because there are workers on strike or on lockout, and they know full well that even this bill will not come into force in time to help them out. So it'll just be for future situations, and maybe that'll be in 12 months after royal assent at the earliest, before this ever comes into force, if it ever does. We have time for a brief question, a quick question and answer. There's time for one last one. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Briefly, Mr. Speaker, if the member can just amplify the other social benefits that workers, in particular unionized workers, have brought to our country, province of Quebec and so forth, through the advocacy of good, solid social programs.
The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville in 45 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to say thank you for the question, but I hope you know the answer. The union movement, since the very beginning, has made progress not only on worker rights, but also has helped society progress in many ways with social justice, more equality, more equity. They did this, the unions did this not just for workers, but for every member of the public or of society. And in Quebec, they have marked our evolution ever since the Quiet Revolution, where the socio-political context was quite different and the conflicts were bitter, they were tough. And so the unions have contributed to the evolution of society. And unfortunately, I have to interrupt the Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Her time is up. Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Get unanimous consent to split my time with the member for Burnaby South.
Is there unanimous consent for this motion? Agreed and carried. The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Today is a powerful day, a day that I actually never thought I would see in the House of Commons after 8 efforts over the years in my time to bring forward legislation to protect workers from anti-scab actions by employers to deny them their fundamental rights. And yet we are here today to bring this into law. On my way here, I learned that the International Criminal Court has now called, or the International Court of Justice today has called out Israel for their the brutal genocide that is happening in Gaza and Rafah, and called on them to end this horrific campaign. This is a day of justice. And I think of Martin Luther King's beautiful statement that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And that slogan's been used many, many, many times over the years. But what people don't often reflect on is that the bending of that arc of justice is done in the face of immense opposition. It is done in the face of threat. It is done in the face of harassment, and it is often done in the face of violence. But the arc of the moral universe will move inevitably towards justice. And I was thinking that, Mr. Speaker, because my mom called me last night. My mom is a hard rock miner's daughter. In fact, her father, Joe McNeil, started in the Cape Breton coal mines back when Dominion Steel used to use the army against the coal miners in New Waterford and Glace Bay. And what they had a classic tactic. They would make the men and families sleep in the winter in tents to break them. And they called them communists, and they called them radicals, and they called them extremists. There was nothing radical or extreme about fighting for a living wage. What was radical and extreme were the capitalists who would use the army and put a machine gun in the church steeple in New Waterford to try and intimidate working people. Shame. But that moral universe, the arc, bent relentlessly towards justice, because there's a moment when you just can't put up with it anymore, and you won't put up with it anymore. So yes, my mom called me last night, and my mom said to me how inspired she is, because these are dark times. But my mom always sees hope. And she said to me, I was so inspired to see the young people marching out of those university commencements. University students who are putting their careers on the line in the United States, facing serious harassment, being called all kinds of hateful things by an establishment that wants to shut them down. And my mom said, young people get it. They're not going to sit silent in the face of a genocide. Because again, what bends towards justice is bending in the face of the harassment and the intimidation and the false threats that these young students are somehow extremists and radicals. There is nothing extreme about speaking up against the mass killing of children. What is extreme is going along with it. Like last night, when the International Criminal Court has called for indictments against Benjamin Netanyahu for war crimes, that this government and its key ministers would be drinking wine and schnapps with Israeli leaders here in Ottawa. Now we can say, yes, we're friends. We are. Canada has a long, deep friendship with Israel. But friends don't let friends commit war crimes. And so my mom said, I was so inspired by these young people who were standing up and walking out and marching in the streets. And my mother said to me, I'm going to get my walker and I'm going to go down and walk with them. My mother has never been to a demonstration in her life, but she sees the mark of the oral.
We have a point of order from the honourable member.
If this is relevant to the bill that we're actually discussing.
We'll remind everyone about I can't even say the word. The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you. I invite the honourable member to come talk to my mom. She'd give him a few lessons in moral justice. That's right. And the reason I'm talking about my mom is a hard rock miner's daughter. And my mom taught me, my mom always said, son, do the right thing throughout your life. And you know what my dad said? Never cross a picket line. That was the family that we grew up in. So when my mom calls me about justice, I listen, and I think the honourable member should listen about justice too, because my mom is not an extremist. My mom stands up for what is right, and we're all called to stand up for what is right, which brings us to this bill. For year in, year out, workers have had to fight for their basic right to be recognized, that if they are facing injustice, poor pay, they have a right to withdraw their labor. And nobody ever gave the union movement or the labor movement anything in this country, certainly not any conservative who's ever lived. That's right. You know, I think of, in my community, the fight for the 8-hour day was won at the Conneagus mine in 1914. And the miners who went on strike at the Conneagus knew what the consequences were. The consequences were that half that workforce was fired and their families were evicted from their homes. None of those men were radicals or extremists like the conservatives of the time called them, but they had reached a point where they were not going to put up with the brutal conditions underground anymore. And they knew what the odds were. They knew that if they stood up, many of them would be thrown out on the street, their families not able to be fed, but they did it for the bigger vision. The bigger right, which is that the arc of the moral universe may be long, and it may take a long time, but it bends inevitably towards justice. I think of all the strikes and labor battles that we've seen in the North, and some of them have been brutal. And there are stories that are told in our region. The 1958 Inco strike, which one of my old-timer friends, Mike Farrell, told me was the mine mill Stalingrad. Families lost everything in that fight. They lost homes. They lost their cars. They lost their marriages. And when I was walking with the copper and nickel miners in 2010 against the Valley strike, their grandchildren told me, my grandfather and my grandmother were in that 58 strike, and I'm here today to live up to that obligation. Because that mark, the arc of the moral universe, it bends towards justice because people know what is right. And what we see, and I see it from conservatives who tell me, you shouldn't speak up about international things, just talk about what's at home. That's not the Canadian way. You shouldn't get involved in something that has nothing to do with you. That's not the Canadian way. The Canadian way is we bend towards justice because it is the right thing. So we are at this moment in Parliament where we may finally pass anti-scab. And I have to say, I have my suspicions, if a conservative government comes in, do you actually think they'll ever defend workers? Not a chance. No. Not a chance. Never. But we're going to see them stand up, and whether or not they stand for the right thing or not. Because this is a moment. And, I was talking about the strikes in the North. There is nothing more bitter than when you bring in scabs to tell a family that we are going to starve you out. That we're going to bust them in, and we're going to use the cops, and we're going to use the state to beat you down and take away the one right that you have as a worker. The right to either supply your employment or take it away if you're not being treated with justice. And we've had many, many of these horrific battles. And it was mentioned earlier that Peggy Whitty, one of the most horrible corporate leaders ever, who was lionized by the Canadian mining industry, that led to the 9 men being killed in Giant Yellowknife Mine. Well, what they also don't tell you about what Peggy Whitty did was that she robbed the pensions of workers from my region at Pamour Mine, and she got away with it. We have to have laws that protect workers and protect them in strikes so that they can engage fairly. And so on this day, when we are here at the final moment to maybe get past the finish line with anti-scab, while the international community is now calling out the genocide in Gaza, we have to think how powerful it is to be at this moment. Because, yeah, the struggle is long, the struggle is hard, the struggle doesn't end easy, but we have to always bend that power towards justice and fairness and the right of the individual, whether in their union or whether as a civil human being, to live in dignity. That's what we're here for. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question Kamal Tar, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Yes, so thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've had the opportunity to speak to the legislation earlier, and one of the things that I like to amplify is the fact that, the federal legislation is fantastic. We're glad to see it. Hopefully it will get the support of every member in the House. But what I'm thinking in terms of is the impact in the rest of the country in terms of, let's say, other provincial legislatures, where we have British Columbia, Quebec, that already have anti-scab legislation, and the potential message that it sends to other provinces and the territories in terms of having anti-scab legislation is okay. We don't need to be fearful of it. And I'm wondering if he could provide his thoughts in regards to the potential impact of this legislation having influence at the provincial jurisdictions where more workers would actually benefit by having anti-scab legislation.
Member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you. It is really important that we see at the federal government level that commitment to the worker right to withdraw their wages and not have to deal with the private security companies, the scab buses coming in, the violence that ends up on the picket lines. And I've seen this in the mining communities I represent, the abuse of worker rights. When we establish a norm, and it shows that it will bring both sides back to the table quicker. When you can't starve out your opponent, when you haven't stockpiled, a year's worth of nickel and decide I'm going to use scab labor and we're going to starve you out. That destroys not just the relationship, but it destroys in the long term communities because people leave and people don't put up with it. This is a good way to settle this.
Question commentaire, l'honorable député Pierre Boucher.
The honourable member for Pierre Boucher. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate the member for Timmins, James Bay, on his excellent speech. I think it was one of the most inspiring speeches we've ever heard in defense of worker rights, and I think the member's always been there to defend the worker, and I'm happy to hear it. But the Bloc at committee tabled an amendment so that instead of it taking a year for this bill to enter into force, it would enter into force immediately. My colleague in his speech talked about people who don't get any wages when they're on strike and they have trouble paying their mortgages and so on, and their rent during that time, and they get replaced by scabs and so on. So my question is, where was all this nice rhetoric before at committee? The honourable member. I'd like to thank the member for that good question. It's clear to me that I'm concerned about the delay before this bill would enter into force. It's a real problem for workers, all across Canada, particularly with if there is a Conservative government next. This Liberal government should keep its commitment to implement this bill now for workers in Canada.
Pat Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was reflecting on my colleague's use of the term arc, and that arc does not bend on its own. In many cases, we have to force it to bend. And while I can take pride as a New Democrat today in the House of Commons for having brought the House of Commons to this moment, I recognize that this effort and the many efforts of NDP MPs over the years we did not arrive at this moment alone. It was the labor movement that fought for this change. They were the agitators, the people who forced MPs to arrive at this moment. Through you, Mr. Speaker, can my colleague just reflect on that incredible activism of the labor movement that brought to the House of Commons to where it is today?
The honourable member for Timmins James Bay, 45 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will share with my colleague when I was in his region on Vancouver Island, and I visited a graveyard that had been desecrated. The Japanese families who worked in the mines, whose graves were desecrated in the Second World War, and there was a plaque on the wall that they had rebuilt the graveyard as best they could, and the plaque was from the nickel and copper miners, Mine Mill Local 598 of Sudbury, who told their workers, they had heard about what had happened to the Japanese, and they raised money in the 1950s so that people in Vancouver Island would know that their comrades were there. That is the arc of justice. It bends because people stand up and say they're going to make it bend, and that's what we're here to do today.
Continuing debate, the honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And I got to say, I'm really honored to be able to follow after my colleague and dear friend, the member from Timmins James Bay. This is a really special occasion. I want to talk a bit about where I'm speaking to you today. I'm actually speaking to you today from the Union Center in Winnipeg after having just met with the Manitoba Federation of Labor. And what's so poignant about that
I have a point of order from the honourable member. I have an honourable Charles Wood St. James and Assiniboia heading
The
there.
member clearly has a prop in the view right behind him. If you want, next time I speak, I'll bring in a big poster that says the message I want to say and put it right up here behind me. He's got to be called out of order, and he can't speak until he moves.
Yeah. The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You've already ruled on this in the past. We've had MPs speaking from a variety of areas. I would ask you, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that Conservative MPs respect this speech and respect the bill. If they are in favour of anti-scab legislation, there should be no problem with them allowing the speech to continue. It is absolutely appropriate, as you've ruled in the past, Mr. Speaker.
All right. Well, while I appreciate there's been a number of occasions in the House, especially during the time that we were doing a lot of online, that we ruled on not having props in the background, not having words in the background, in some cases not having flags in the background. So maybe what I can ask if we can maybe get rid of the wording in the background, or just perfect. There you go. When we ask it, it shall be done. The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Mr. Speaker, I noticed that the Conservatives are upset because I was going to reference the Winnipeg strike, actually, and these are pictures about the Winnipeg strike behind me, and they actually capture the story even better than the words. But I want to talk about why it's so important, and maybe this is why the Conservatives are upset, because they don't like when the power of workers come together to fight back and defend working people. But what happened in 1919, in the very same time we find ourselves in right now, from mid-May to late June of 1919, 30,000 workers, basically the entire working force of Winnipeg, and in a lot of ways all of Manitoba at the time, came together and shut down the city and effectively shut down the province, fighting for fairness for workers. They were protesting the unfair work conditions, the poverty, and specifically issues like collective bargaining. And it is so poignant that I am here in Winnipeg at the Union Center, having just spoken with the Manitoba Federation of Labor and their president, Kevin Rebeck, and I want to thank him for all his hard work and the MFL for all their hard work. But it's so poignant, I think, speaking to this bill today in this place from this spot. And I have to say what an honor it is that today our Bill C-58 that we fought for, will ban scabs once and for all at the federal level. This is a historic result of the hard work of New Democrats. And I have to say this would not have happened but for New Democrats forcing this government to do this. And I also have to acknowledge that this would not have happened but for labor and for unions who have long led the charge for anti-scab legislation. And I want to thank them. I also have to acknowledge that this is an accomplishment that we have achieved, that we are debating this right now in the House, that the Manitoba NDP are also going to move forward with. And I want to salute and acknowledge that. But I have to say, This has been a long time coming. New Democrats have been fighting for decades for this to happen. In the past 15 years, New Democrats have tabled anti-SCAB legislation 8 times. 8 times, where unions, labor, and New Democrats have fought for this. The last time it came for vote in 2016, the Liberals and Conservatives teamed up to vote against it. The leader of the Conservatives voted against banning scabs 8 times in the past. So it's clear whose side they stand on. But with the supporting guidance of our labor allies, with union leaders and activists, we have finally secured this moment. This legislation is about giving more power to workers. It's about giving power to workers so they can negotiate a fair deal and so we can ban scabs once and for all. And let's talk about what that means. Banning scabs is about giving more power to workers and less power to the big bosses and to CEOs. It's about ensuring that when a worker makes that difficult decision to go on strike, that their jobs aren't stolen by scabs. That's what this is about. Bannir les scabs au niveau fédéral, c'est
Banning scabs at the federal level is historic. Quebec was ahead of the curve on this and did so at the provincial level in Quebec. This bill, championed by my colleague, the member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie, takes inspiration from Quebec's legislation. But this bill goes even further because now many Quebecers working under federally regulated workplaces will have stronger rights, and that's not thanks to the Liberals, the Conservatives, or the Bloc Québécois. It's thanks to the NDP. If the NDP was government, the legislation would be even stronger, but we had to work with Liberals. Liberals, throughout this process, have sided with employers, but the NDP has always sided with workers. I'm proud of the NDP. This is a historic moment. Banning replacement workers will give more power to workers, less power to CEOs. Workers will have more bargaining power to negotiate better salaries. And in times of high inflation, this is exactly what workers need.
Workers get the respect they deserve. That's what's needed now more than ever, because we know times are tough. We know that workers are getting gouged by corporate greed at the grocery stores, corporate greed when it comes to corporate landlords jacking up rents, and corporate greed in telcos who charge Canadians some of the highest fees in the world for their cell phones and internet services. But workers are fighting back. We are seeing workers organizing across this country. We're seeing it recently in Starbucks and Amazon. We're seeing it in the public and private sector. Unions are on the front line of fighting inflation because that's what unions do. They fight for working people. And New Democrats as well. This anti-SCAB legislation is one additional tool to protect workers from getting ripped off and exploited by big bosses. But I want to acknowledge that this isn't the only thing New Democrats have fought for. Specifically for workers, we have forced the federal government to bring in 2 additional measures already. We have made it the law of the land in Canada that federal regulated workers will get 10 paid days of sick leave. That was never the law before. We made that happen. We also forced this government to bring in a Sustainable Jobs Act that ensures that workers have a seat at the table by law. And that anytime we discuss the future of jobs in our country, that we talk about training opportunities for workers that go through unions, that we create good union jobs with good wages as we look towards a net zero economy. That's what we established with the Sustainable Jobs Act. Again, something the Conservatives tried to fight against it every step of the way. Speaking of fighting every step of the way, I want to be very clear. When I say New Democrats made this happen, it's because we had to force the Liberals, we had to force the Prime Minister to act. We know that the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party voted against anti-SCAB legislation just a few years ago. Without unions and without the New Democrats, nothing happens. None of this happens. New Democrats had to force the Prime Minister to bring in this legislation after decades. And even then, after forcing them to bring it in, they missed the mark. We had to fight to strengthen the legislation for workers with amendments. And earlier this month, we amended the bill to speed up the implementation from 18 months to 12 months. Workers will be protected sooner because of that. We also made sure that we closed loopholes to prevent any attempts of employers from skirting these laws. We also specifically made sure that workers will not be exploited by employers who try to use employees from another workplace or use students or volunteers as scab workers. This is about ensuring employees can strike for better wages without their bargaining rights being threatened. Big bosses will have to now show up in good faith for bargaining at the bargaining table and to negotiate in a manner of good faith. But imagine what we could have done if the out-of-touch Liberals were not in the way. Strong anti-scab legislation would already have been in place. Corporate greed and big bosses would be in check. But I also want to talk about the serious risk presented by the leader of the Conservatives. The leader of the Conservatives likes to cosplay that he's there for working people. But we all know that what the leader of the Conservatives and the Conservative parties want to do is wage a war against unions, a war against workers, in direct contrast to what this bill is all about. The leader of the Conservative Party would bring back anti-union legislation as he did when he was in cabinet with the Harper government. He would bring in laws to make it harder for workers to fight for better deals. In 2013, the leader of the Conservative Party said very boldly, and I quote, "I am the first federal politician to make a dedicated push towards bringing..."
I have to apologize to the honourable member, but the 10 minutes has gone by in a flash. Maybe he'll have an opportunity to finish his speech in maybe some response to some of the questions. Questions and comments? The honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate where it is that the leader of the New Democratic Party is. In fact, if he goes a little bit further down Main Street, you'll see that we have the iconic image of the streetcar sculpture, which is a very significant icon, not only for Winnipeg, but I would suggest to you for all of Canada, because of what the meaning behind the streetcar and the 1919 general strike. And it's really ironic in the sense that you have today the anti-replacement legislation or anti-scab legislation, and that cart, that streetcar, was perceived coming in as replacement workers, Mr. Speaker. So I thought I really did appreciate the background. Having said that, I'm wondering if the leader could provide his thoughts in regards to, with the federal legislation that we're having today, and it looks like we'll get all party support in passing the legislation, if not today, possibly Monday. Whenever it happens, it happens. The question is, does he agree with me that it sends a very encouraging messages to other jurisdictions? And hopefully, for example, the province of Manitoba will quickly have anti-scab legislation on the books too.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thanks for the question. I had always hoped, and I know labor leaders and union leaders had always hoped, that establishing anti-scab legislation at the federal level would be used as a tool to inspire and to inform other provincial jurisdictions to bring in similar legislation. Ultimately, for New Democrats, for union leaders, for labor leaders, the goal is to ensure that nowhere in our country, at no jurisdiction, at no level, will workers ever be threatened by scabs stealing their jobs. And that's ultimately the goal of New Democrats. We want to make it very clear. We want workers to be able to negotiate fair deals. And if they choose to have to go on strike to fight for those fairness and fight for fair wages, they do so without the threat of a scab stealing their job. And that's what I hope to achieve with this bill, and what we all, as New Democrats, hope to achieve, and what the labor movement hopes to achieve, is inspiration to inspire other provincial jurisdictions to bring it in. But with Manitoba, rest assured, there's already a strong commitment from the Premier of Manitoba to bring in anti-scab legislation. They've already tabled it, and they will be moving forward.
Questions and comments? Questions, commentaires? L'honorable député de Repentigny.
The honourable member for Repentigny. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for Burnaby South for his speech. He didn't seem to give much credit to the Bloc Québécois, though. There are gaps in the bill. For instance, federal public servants are not among the workers who will be covered by this legislation. There's another aspect that I would like to highlight. which is the fact that this bill will only come into effect 12 months after royal assent. In committee, the Bloc Québécois moved an amendment that the bill come into force and be effective immediately after royal assent. So can the member for Burnaby South explain to us how this 12-month delay can be considered reasonable, given that there's a minority government and the bill could not end up being implemented? The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party. Thank you for the question. We're in this situation that we're in now thanks to the NDP. We would not have anti-scab legislation if it hadn't been for the NDP putting pressure on the government. And it's also because of the NDP Liberal agreement. Without the NDP, there wouldn't have been this pressure to move forward with this legislation. Unions have also worked very hard for this legislation, and we're grateful for their help. As for the implementation timeline, we brought it down from 18 months. The Liberals wanted it to be an 18-month implementation delay, and we brought that down to 12 months. We need to be very clear about the fact that without the NDP putting pressure on the government, this legislation never would have been tabled, and we wouldn't be debating it now. It is thanks to the NDP that workers in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada who work in federally regulated workplaces will have these protections and rights.
Griesbach.
Powerful paychecks come from powerful unions, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to be a New Democrat today, and I thank the leader of the Democratic Party for their consistent efforts in making what we know was possible reality. 15 years New Democrats have tabled this piece of legislation. 8 times have we seen the Liberals and Conservatives join forces to make certain workers aren't more powerful. This is a remarkable day for workers. I thank workers. I thank all my colleagues of the New Democratic Party for this work. But I'm nervous and I'm scared that we could possibly see a Conservative government try to roll back some of these protections, try to put workers back to work like they often do by back-to-work legislation when they join forces with Liberals. Can the members speak to how important it is to have powerful unions?
I like it when I say short questions, and here we go for a short answer. The Honourable Leader of the NDP.
Well, I got to thank my colleague for that question, a great question. And he's right to be worried. We saw that the Conservatives have voted against back-to-work legislation in the past. The leader voted against it 8 times in the past. He is in favor of back-to-work legislation. He's opposed anti-scab legislation. He's fought card check legislation. He's voted against the minimum wage, not once, but twice. He vowed to cut workers' pensions and to slash employment insurance to save $500 million for CEOs, but leaving workers out to dry. So we know this is a legitimate concern. We believe very strongly, not only do we need to have this legislation, we need to ensure that there's anti-scab legislation that's in place, but we also need to be very clear that strong unions have to be supported so they can fight for good wages for workers. The only way workers get fairness is with strong unions. So let us be very clear, New Democrats are the only labor party at the federal level. We are proudly founded by unions and will always defend unions' ability to fight for workers to ensure they get fair wages and fair work conditions.
Resuming debate. Seeing none, is the House ready for the question? The question is as follows. Madame Bibeau.
Bibeau, seconded by Mr. Boissonneau.
An act to amend the Canada Labour Code and the Canada Industrial Relations Board regulations. 2012 be now read a third time and do pass. If a member participating in person wishes the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I invite them to rise and indicate to the chair, the honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
For this historic vote, decades in the making, I would ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Speaker.
Pursuant to Standing Order 45, the division stands deferred until Monday, May 27th, 2024, at the expiry of the time provided for oral questions. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the daily hour of adjournment of the next sitting be midnight pursuant to standing an order adopted on February 28th, 2024. Moreover, we were unable to reach an agreement under 78.1 or 78.2 standing orders as for the second reading stage of C-45, an act to amend the Canada-Newfoundland Offshore Agreement and the implementation of the Canada-Nova Scotia Agreement on offshore oil and gas, and to amend other legislation under the terms of Standing Order 78.3, I give notice that at the next sitting of the House, a minister will